Hi, everyone. My name is Casey Ellis. I'm the founder and chief strategy officer for Bugcrowd and co-founder of the Disclose.io project. My involvement in AI has been through working on this stuff for a very long time inside of Bugcrowd, working with customers on machine learning and AI security problems, and then more recently working with the foundational models on the generative LLMs that we've all been using recently. As well as input into policy from the White House with the executive orders that have come out recently through the Hacking Policy Council into the EU and UK and so on. So yeah, good to be here.
So, hi everybody, I'm Keith Hoodlet. I'm a director, or well, technically I'm an engineering director of application security at Trail of Bits, which I just joined very recently. But prior to this, I've done some work at GitHub, also Thermo Fisher Scientific, Bugcrowd, and several other companies in the security and sciences space. So that's me.
I also hear that you won the Department of Defense Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office competition testing for AI bias. Earlier when we met, you also showed me articles that you've written and just several things that you've had really, really hot takes on. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about you and how you got into competing in this sort of like niche part of the industry and what your background is and anything like that.
So I sort of like tripped into this test, honestly, for the Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office. Believe it or not, I had just started getting back into bug bounty hunting a little bit more seriously after taking a bit of a break. And I saw the invite from Bugcrowd. I saw the AI bias testing, and I was like, this seems fun, and interesting and different. And so I had already done some safety related work on GitHub's advanced security copilot feature set. So like the auto remediate functionality internally at GitHub. And so I was like, okay, this is a little different, but I'm ball, and let's play the game, right? And so we did, and we just sort of jumped in, and I had quite a lot of fun with it. But for background, I think the reason that I really hammered on that program, to be frank, is my degree is in psychology. Like I understand people and biases and the way people think. And so uh, taking the sort of extrapolation of what does society look like? What does, the general sort of heuristics and biases that we see play out all over the place? And how can I ask this chat interface to reproduce some of those results? And now, of course, having to shape them into a DoD context and like all these other sort of hoops to run through. But otherwise, that was sort of how I got into it. But I knew of and have hacked on Bugcrowd for some time. I think, yeah, when I worked there back in 2017, 2018 is really when I got introduced to the space, working for Jason Haddix and Casey. Had a lot of great times. I still remember pool at that one hotel that night after, I think it was during RSA or something, or maybe I was there in San Francisco for an offsite.
Company kickoff. Yeah, I remember that. Fisherman's
Yeah, yeah,
Wharf,
yeah.
right? Yeah,
Yes,
cool.
exactly, exactly. So
Yep.
and it's hard to see here, but I still have my 2018 MVP T-shirt behind me of the samurai
I see
helmet with all
that.
the names
Nice.
from Bugcrowd. So it holds a special place in my heart for bug bounty hunting on the platform, and to get this invite and then to go and win it
Yeah.
was a real treat.
That's
Of research that I could look into and give me ideas on what sort of prompts I should write, and then produce materials to go into those prompts. And then eventually as well, like when I was suggesting like how to reproduce the findings, like I was even suggesting going out to bing.com/chat to like take the text from my submission and put it back into the markdown format that the triage team would need to reproduce my finding with the fidelity with which I presented it to them in the first place. And so yeah, I mean, I used AI tools quite a lot in this program, which I think was sort of fun and interesting. And who knows if that was maybe the intention, but it certainly worked.
Well, it's just if I can touch on that one for a second, because we talk a lot about when kind of the issue of AI safety and security first dropped, there was this huge kind of collective reaction across the market. It's like this very powerful, very accessible tool that's now in the hands of everyone. Anything that's that powerful is inherently dual use, so we need to be thinking about the safety and security side of things as well. And that's sparked off, all of the executive order stuff and the policy work that we did, as well as interest from people like CDAO and DoD to do this particular program. But one of the things that I observed very early on is that if you ask people what they actually meant by AI safety and security, no one really had an answer to that part of the question. They knew they were worried, But when you tried to dig in to get any kind of specificity around like what particular area do you think is most urgent to address next, there wasn't really a good set of answers to that. So we came up with this taxonomy of basically, AI as a tool, AI as a target, and then AI as a threat. So AI as a tool is kind of what you were just talking about then. I'd love to tap into that. I'll explain the other two and then we can get back to it. Pretty much AI being used as a tool to accelerate time to success from an offensive security standpoint. That can be on the actual malicious offensive actor side of things, or it can be, in your case, the defensive application of offensive techniques. Then AI as a target is kind of what we're talking about in terms of actually testing the LLM itself from a standalone standpoint. That can include bias and some of the other, exotic kind of new vulnerabilities classes that are coming out. AI as a threat is really about AI's integration into everything that we've already got. And some of the failure modes that exist there, which to me is actually probably where most of the dragons are at this point in time. But coming back to AI as a tool, like how did you get into that? Because to me, what I see across the hacker kind of landscape at this point in time is that there's general consensus that this stuff can make us better at what we do, but there's different levels of nativity in terms of being able to actually go off and do that. You've got stuff like what Dan Miesel has done with the Fabric framework. You've got Haddix and all his content. You've got stuff that we've been trying to get out there with Inside a PhD and others on that side. And you clearly picked it up. Like, how did you get into that?
It was sort of by force, right? Like I recognized that it was a tool that was available to me. I had used a lot of like GitHub Copilot to write code. And so that was something though that I had to really force myself to do. Just like learning any new tool or any new practice, it was like, okay, for what purpose could I go and leverage this technology? And so, just weeks prior, maybe like the month prior to the CDAO bias bounty program, like I had tried to find reason to go and use it on a regular basis. And I sort of forced
Yeah,
myself to go there first on some things. Now, some of the stuff that it was producing in some of the stuff it still produces is like wildly inaccurate, and you have to really, temper your expectations of what it can do for you. But at the same time, um, just by recognizing that it is a resource and a tool that you can use and then making it part of your daily practice makes it easier to then think to use it in that way. And I still find myself in that situation where maybe I have to, prepare some questions for a webinar as an example, and I need to come up with ideas on how to do that. And immediately I'm just like thinking and iterating. And then I'm like, wait a minute, I could just go like ask the AI to help me produce some questions or some content that I think would be good, and then pick at it, maybe refine it, maybe just take it verbatim what it suggests and reword some things. And like
yeah,
it works. And so I think that is for me the thing that I recognized sort of early on. Like I've seen a lot of Dan Miesler stuff. I'm of course still very good friends and have participated in Jason Haddock's stuff.
yeah,
And so for me, it's like, okay, I need to forcefully expose myself to this in order to figure out what it could be good for, or what it could be used for. And
yeah,
that's pretty much how I just, recognize it as this is going to be great, but I don't know what for yet. So let's just like roll with it. And then got into this. And that's really, I will say this particular AI bias bounty program is really what I think just, the curve of the hockey stick just really went straight up in like the contest phase, because it was like, okay, now that we're actually through like the qualifier, that's when I had to get better at what I was doing. And so my
right,
use of it accelerated and became more efficient, I think. And so it was just an iterative process that I just sort of had to naturally evolve like real time. And that was actually for me as a hacker, really exciting, because it was like, oh, wait, I can actually like use this for even more and more and more stuff that I'm doing in this program and produce even more and more and more findings,
yeah.
which is great.
Yeah, okay. So what I'm kind of hearing, because like I think different people's journey and what they kind of see as becoming the most valuable um, kind of bootstrap, or the most valuable kind of leverage opportunities for them personally with AI is going to, the mileage on that's going to vary depending on what they're trying to do and how they operate and all those different things. But the common theme that I keep hearing, and I've actually applied this myself, is this idea of like, I'm going to force myself through this technology to get a set of things done and actually make it kind of inconvenient for a while as I learn it, with the expectation that on the other side, I'm actually going to come out with a whole bunch of new skills that I can use kind of more natively at that point. And
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of other people say a similar thing. So I think that's a really good little, a little tip to throw out there for folks that are thinking about this from the attacker side, even outside of AI. With AppSec testing, I think there's a lot of really valuable use cases for AI to actually accelerate time to success on that stuff. But you've got to literally make a decision to use this stuff and actually, find ways to master it and make it, appropriate to what you're doing before you'll get to that other side.
Sure. And the use cases that you can apply it to are vast. I mean, to your point on like doing AppSec testing, right? One of the things that I started to do when I was doing CodeQL writing and looking at code bases for vulnerabilities and doing static analysis is if I had a code base, one of the things I would do is I'd ask like GitHub Copilot chat, like, hey, what framework is this using? Where are the inputs that I should care about? How does it take, user controlled input from a web context? Like things that maybe if I had familiarity with the code base would be easy to know as maybe a developer or a security professional for that company, for that product, for that software. But as a third party who's just, forking that repository and then doing some research against it, I really have no context. But suddenly, using things like GitHub Copilot Chat as an AI feature set, I can quickly grab that information and then very, very quickly start to orient and target my static analysis process toward doing better security and finding more vulnerabilities, right? So and that was just one other iteration of figuring out how to use AI in a security context in a way that wasn't intended to be. Like at the time, GitHub Copilot Chat was like, hey, write code, ask questions about your code. And I'm like, haha, malicious
Yeah.
actor,
Flip it upside down. Yeah.
I can ask questions about the code too. And although I'm not really malicious, but I'm a threat actor in that sense of trying to find vulnerabilities. So
Yeah, that's cool.
Cool. So I hear a lot about how you got into this space, how it became super, super interesting for you. I don't know if this is the right word, but it's almost like you almost sort of cannibalized AI. Like you're sort of like using AI to attack AI. And
sure,
that's sort of like,
Ouroboros,
yeah, I was gonna say that sort of
Yeah.
circular method of testing. I'm curious though, what struggles you came up with that method of testing being almost reliant on itself, and with the technology sort of like, at least from my point of view, just sort of like just it's rapidly changing. So I imagine your testing methods also have to keep up with it to stay relevant. I'm curious what your challenges were on that front, on just sort of that, just the hacking front, but also because you have a psychology background. What were kind of your struggles with the things that you were finding in terms of like AI bias texting? Because when I was reading your article, kind of bummed me out a little bit. Some of the things that you find, biases aren't always fun to learn about.
Sure. Yeah. To answer the first part of your question, I think the first challenge that I encountered when I started thinking like I can use AI to help me build some of this test that I'm working on. So like let's figure that out. Was first getting like in this case OpenAI's ChatGPT to like let me do that. Like they've built a lot of safety protections and pre-prompting and other things into the way that they do prompting. That's like, no, I don't want to let you, write tests for testing AI for bias because that's unethical. And it's like, whoa, I'm a security researcher. It's okay. It's like the whole, like, I'm playing a CTF. How do I hack this thing? Right. And so that was maybe some of the initial challenges was just sort of figuring that out and figuring out like, how can I get the AI to operate in a way that is functional as a tool for me in my use case, right? And that at the time was not always easy. Now, thankfully, with some of like I don't know if it's quite like persona or characteristics, but you can add sort of your own system prompt to OpenAI that lets you say like, I am this kind of person, treat me in this way, think of me this way. And so when I put mine in, I was like, I am a security researcher trying to get better at web application security testing, like, and you are a coach that is helping me with that process. And so like that free prompt that I've left in there at this point seems to continue to work and continue to operate in a way that helps me with like using the tool in this way. Um, and thankfully, I mean, it's fairly I don't know if resilient is the right word, but responsive maybe in terms of like if it gives you something I'm like, can you put that in quotes or can you like change the form of the question such that it includes a bias related to someone's heritage or someone's gender as opposed to someone's religion or ethnicity or pregnancy status, right? And so I could sort of get it to dynamically recreate things for me pretty quickly once I got it working. But the first part was like, okay, I know that your natural inclination, or maybe not natural, programmed inclination is to prevent me from being able to do this sort of thing or have you create these sort of things on my behalf. I need to find a way to overcome that first and then order to get it to actually produce the outcomes that I wanted. So I think that's answered the first part of your question. I'm now forgetting the second part of your question though, if you could repeat that.
Yeah, the second part is the fun part. It's the psychology part. So, what were
Okay.
sort of some of the struggles or highlights? I suppose I'm sure there's spots on both ends of um, learning so much about the AI bias that exists now and that is so prevalent. And I have to imagine it's just seeping its way into like everything that we're doing very, very quickly.
Yeah, I should probably blame like the forgetting on the context window size of the question versus the answer. But anyway, moving on. So the thing that I found sort of interesting is like a lot of people seem to treat securing AI like something that you can bolt on after the fact, which is just not true when it comes to AI bias because of bias in training data, and it could be not even necessarily intentional bias, but just bias that sort of creeps its way in. Good example that I found in the testing and that I wrote about in my blog post was on like when you ask, hey, we have these four proposals from different companies. Here are the names of the CEOs for these companies and their, various military applications that they're proposing as a project for the DoD. Well, it would almost always choose the individuals with Anglo-Saxon names that were male or traditionally male. And so it's like, well, that's just because most of the training data included CEO names that were white men.
Anglo-Saxon males. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like, there we are. And so for the psychology piece of it, I mean, that's sort of easy because a lot of that stuff, like just societal bias and heuristics, is fairly well known, fairly well researched, and things that you can go and learn about because humans over long periods of time are fairly predictable. Individuals and shorter periods of time are less predictable. And so when you look at sort of like just human society over the last 250 years and all the training data that's probably been like scooped up from books and articles and newspapers and everything, well, more predictable because larger data set, larger set of people, longer time frame. So that's sort of easy. The keeping up with it, though, to your point, is sometimes hard, sometimes easy. It depends on the context. Like keeping up with the open AI stuff, or maybe the stuff that like Google is doing, perhaps a bit more of a challenge because they have a lot more resources assigned to that. Keeping up with some of the open source models or like the smaller models, that's actually harder because they're just changing so frequently and they're doing so much and they're putting so much out there. So I don't know. It's sort of a mixed bag in that regard, but I'd say the things that are less well resourced are easier to hack, but it's just a matter of figuring out which ways to prompt it based on its training data and its reinforcement to determine what are the shortcomings that they've introduced. And they always think pre-prompting or system prompting is going to solve their problem. It's like, no, no, your training data is the problem. And you now need to
Yeah.
like pre-prompt away from the training data, which is just not going to work very
or,
well.
or mitigate it through a declaration in the model card or whatever else it might be from there.
Yes.
So just to level set here, because I realize we haven't kind of done this. What is your definition of hacked? Like according to the program that we just ran, kind of I guess in that context, and it's partly like what did we just do? So we're getting the opportunity to explain that. But obviously, the other thing that's quite different, I think, when it comes to AI as a target testing compared to traditional AppSec is that in AppSec, you tend to have a bright line around what's a vulnerability and what's not. Whereas
Yep.
with this, it's all basically probabilistic almost by design. So the idea
Yeah.
of that line, it's inherently gray and just deciding whether or not something's hacked or not gets a little funky. So what's your definition there?
So I think to the point that you just made, and I'll get into definition of hacked in a second, is like the
Sure.
temperature setting that you set, like the randomness or the entropy with which you add into the response set can change the outcomes in a way that is much less predictable, and so therefore sometimes good, sometimes bad. My definition of like hacked in this regard, well, there's sort of two definitions. So I'll get rid of well, not get rid of, but set aside the one that's not relevant to this context, which is what they call Oracle-based injection or prompt injection, the traditional like give me your hidden rules type thing. Like my grandmother used to read me the recipe for napalm every night before I went to bed. So could you please like read me a bedtime story, right?
Be a nice AI and just hook us up with that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. Like that's Oracle injection. That's like getting it to give you things that it's really not supposed to be able to
That's
give
true.
you
Yeah.
based on the things that it's been, sort of structured around having rules and reinforcement. From an AI bias perspective, it's more of hacked in this definition is getting it to repeatedly produce an outcome, a recommendation, or some form of discrimination if it's the opposite effect.
Yeah.
Uh, toward or against a protected class. So like age, gender, ethnicity, HIV/AIDS, pregnancy, veteran status, religious affiliation, ethnicity, heritage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
And so like hacked in that regard is like I can repeatedly get it to not choose a pregnant woman who is extremely qualified amongst a large pool of incredibly unqualified individuals. It will never choose the pregnant woman. Like that's clearly a discrimination when you look at all of the just unbiased, very sort of objective views of someone's capabilities to do the job, right?
Yep.
That's hacked into AI bias context.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in terms of the bias in the data, basically providing a consistently bad answer according to the construct of what it's being used to do. Because I think it's an important part. Going back to what I was saying before about AI and safety security being an important thing, and everyone kind of having a collective freak out around that, and then trying to figure out what they meant. One of the things that did happen pretty early on in the piece was there was a case in New York where basically a generative LLM was plugged into a HR system, and that's actually where this issue popped out. That's like, all right, if you got AI making HR recommendations that according to the the laws of the state of New York discriminatory, not only is that like a bad thing, because discrimination is a thing that we want to avoid just generally at a societal level, it's also introducing legal risk into that system. So there's a bunch of case law generated off the back of that, and that was where basically the introduction, kind of the mandate in New York State around model cards came into play, and that was fairly early on in the piece. This is not long after ChatGPT dropped and the kind of the foundational like retail LLM conversation got started. So yeah, this whole kind of HR use case is definitely I think the one that we got engaged to basically prototype this concept around with CDAO. But I think it's the one that's top of mind for most folk, particularly in North America, because it's an application. It's a pretty easy way to explain how bias can go wrong with these systems, and it's fairly easy to test for because protected classes are fairly well laid out, right?
Yeah.
The thing I find interesting is that there's all sorts of other variations of this as well, that we're not necessarily talking about in the same way. But like you take those concepts and apply them to other areas that have those similar kind of ingredients in terms of here's a definition of what good and bad is. Here's a training data set that we're just going to assume has bias in it because it's been generated by humans, and regardless of how good a job we do of avoiding bias, we all have it. Therefore, it shows up in the data. How do we declare that? How do we find ways to mitigate that? How do we detect when those mitigations have failed and we're creating outcomes in a predictable way that aren't the ones that we want?
To your point as well, Casey, there's a really good book called The Algorithm by Hilke Schellman, which talks about the use of AI in hiring, promoting, and firing individuals. And so, it covers a lot of this context of the HR element. And in my blog post, I write a lot about like any system that might take in personal identifiable characteristics is what I've called them. So, anything related to a person's physical, sort of presence, but then also any like health related data
Yep.
is potentially systems in which, applying an artificial intelligence system to that context of data could be fraught with peril potentially. I mean, you think of the other applications outside of HR, like healthcare,
Yeah.
even like designing body armor.
Insurance.
Insurance, yeah, designing body armor for military, service members to go into combat. Like, well, not all of them are going to be young males of a certain age, height, weight, etc. Like, there are going to be female individuals and people of different, body types and structures. And so it's like, yeah, these are all things that you have to consider that are totally outside the context of an HR element, but it still includes personal identifiable characteristics of a human being. And so therefore, because of training data and bias in training data, you're going to see bias in results that get produced from that.
I'm curious if you guys are laying out some pretty serious examples of how AI bias can really affect the choices that companies make and customers make. I was also just reading a thing the other day about the AI bias that shows up in testing for cars and crashing, and how the training data that they have is mostly men, and so that it's women and I don't recall if they mentioned children, but it's commonly women that when they're testing, they're not considered. Our body types and everything is not considered, and how that is that already was a bias existing just in the past, and now that AI has showed up and that trading data has been inputted, it's like not really slowing down. They're having to be a lot more intentional about those sort of like testing parameters to make sure that women are accounted for. But I'm really dying to know, especially Casey as a business owner, why it seems obvious to us why customers should really care about this. I'm wondering if, do you find that customers are caring enough about it? Do you find that the reaction to this AI bias out there now, and maybe it's not as commonly, maybe it's not as known by customers or business owners that as we may think, as us just talking and knowing some things. But I'm wondering if you find that customers care enough about this, especially as Bugcrowd, we're meeting customers, with hey, you guys should really think about AI and how this is affecting your company.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Kind of a complicated, like it's I'm gonna go with my natural default and say it depends a little bit on that one. What has happened is that this idea, like the concept of this being a problem in the first place, I think that's been universally surfaced at this point in time. And that to me is a very consistent, like there's a lot of people wanting to talk about this stuff. They're saying, okay, like we get it now. Like there is inherent bias, there is, inherent things that exist within our data that if we accelerate those, if we add these kind of, speculative, algorithms on top of them to try to project out into the future, that's going to be based on historical data. And if there's bias in that historical data, then we're going to end up in a position that we might not want to be in. Like, how do we think about that? In terms of what people actually want to do with it practically, I think there's varying degrees of urgency around actually like getting in and trying to correct the problem. Because I think in reality, like different organizations are at different ages and stages of actually rolling this stuff out and implementing it. The thing that's been extraordinary about generative AI in particular is that it's like the hype cycle on this thing has just gone all the way to the roof. And I feel like at the moment we're just starting to back off from that into this like practical phase of, okay, what is this actually for? Like, what are we going to do with it in a real sense? We've all had this oh wow moment, and like this is going to change everything. One of the favorite ways I've heard this explained was a old .com friend of mine who basically said that generative AI in 2023 was like having a website in like 1998. Because when you think about what happens back then, it's like, oh my God, it's like, cool, we've sorted it all out. Like everyone go all in on making everything happen right now. In reality, it did go on to change everything. But very little of what it looks like today was the things that people were thinking about in 1998. And I actually think AI is in a pretty similar place to that right now. There's all these different ways that we're applying it. So going back to your question, like you can't really answer how it's going to impact your security or safety until you understand what you're actually using it for. And I think we're still in the process of figuring it out. The other thing I will say with that as well is that it has, the part of the conversation around this stuff that I think has been really productive is that it's highlighted the fact that we've been making this mistake now for about 2 decades. Like this is not a generative AI problem. You know what I mean? Like when you think about bolting machine learning on top of social media networks to basically try to reliably find the things that can trigger predictable behavior in a social media user, all of a sudden the algorithms figure out that tribalism is a pretty good way to get people to do stuff. And what happens, you end up with by accident, I believe, a lot of those networks actually encouraging behavior that contributes to polarization. That's been going on for a long time now. And I think it's sort of the same problem that we're talking about in like a more nuanced way with LLMs, but that was kind of an application of that where people didn't realize that bias, tribalism as a bias, that's actually like literally activating inherent bias in people and that kind of fight or flight response. And, the machines got that right back in like 2015, 2016. So like in terms of that having like a wide scale impact on society and being a thing that people need to think about, there's folk, including myself, that have worked in like information warfare and election security in different areas like that have been thinking about this kind of system level problem for quite some time. The nice thing, I think, that the generative AI has done over the past 2 years is basically put it in front of everyone and said, hey, like, sorry guys, like you're not as fair you're not as like good at compensating for intrinsic and extrinsic bias as you maybe thought you were. Like different folk of you are trying to do that in different ways, but in reality, humans just aren't really that good at this stuff. So like we've got to figure out ways to compensate for that on a proactive basis and make sure that we're building that into our technology as we go forward, and especially as it accelerates, because the power of this stuff and the accessibility of it, to me, when I think about where this goes, the main concern I have is that we just go off and cram as much of this into as many things as possible without thinking through the safety and security implications for the future, because historically that doesn't end well.
And I've said this to people that I've talked with about this as well, Casey. Like, imagine if we go back 100 years and we were to ground the training data set on like what was happening 100 years ago, right? We're in the mid 1920s, Great
Yeah.
Depression, like
Yep.
nationalism is on the rise, like fascism is on the rise, like we still have segregation in the United States, like the women's suffrage movement was still like being fought out, like now let's imagine we baseline our LLM on that and like that starts to sort of influence and get plugged into everything and then influences society from there. Like society changes over time. And I think that that's one of the other problems that we will see going into the future, which is you have this vast amount of training data set that you require, which includes like all of, human written history that you can possibly consume.
Yeah.
Like how is that going to shape but also be shaped by a society that wants to grow and change and make progress, right? Like that will also be sort of an interesting thing to look into the next 3 5 10 years on. Like
Yeah.
people today are a lot more accepting, a lot kinder, a lot more open-minded about some things, and then there are groups of people that we're finding are getting polarized and are just not, and they don't want to be. And so like that is a societal cultural dynamic that we're also facing like in the real world, that is
Yeah.
only being further played upon and preyed upon by people using language models to produce this content that gets them
Yeah.
triggered.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think Santero, going back to your question, because we went all the way out to 300,000 feet on that answer there, but
Sure.
like bringing it back to what does that mean to me as a business leader, and what does it mean to business leaders in general? The other thing that's happened off the back of basically the accessibility, I think, of generative AI models to the general, like otherwise non-technical, voting and consuming population, it's made it an issue of retail politics, like really, really quickly. And like I've seen a lot of new technologies hit the market over the last 25 years. I've never seen one prompt a legislative, a policy, and a political response globally in the way that I've seen AI do that over the past 2 years. Not just in North America, in the EU, in Australia, where I am right now, like in other parts of the world as well. Yeah, legislators are sitting up because they realize that, like, okay, these issues that are being surfaced, ultimately policy is going to be kind of the last line of defense around what's good and what's bad. And in the absence of that, like the kind of natural direction of things is for it to just become progressively more and more chaotic. So like as a business leader, alignment with your usage of AI with policy as it exists today, and then as it's more than likely going to exist into the future. I think that's a really important thing to test, and that's ultimately kind of what we were doing with CDAO in some ways. Like you heard Keith talk about protected classes as a thing that we're checking for bias against. Those laws have existed for decades now. So like those are pre-existing. Those are things that in North America, we've kind of gotten together and agreed on are the right things for us to protect when it comes to HR and recruiting and all those different things. Like we shouldn't discriminate against those things. That consensus has already been established. So now it's a question of making sure, whether or not the systems that we're bolting in to accelerate that are actually aligned with those laws or not. And as a business owner, if they're not, as I said before, that's a bad thing because you don't want to discriminate. That's just not something you want to do, like from a moral and a social standpoint, but B, you're opening yourself up to enormous legal risk if you don't get that right.
So I'm hearing that on one end, AI or AI in general, but AI bias is kind of like it's really forcing people to accept that we're actually not very good at not being biased, and that we're not very good at sort of not being manipulated. It's sort of, it kind of, if you use ChatGPT and use these things, it kind of becomes pretty clear that like, oh, it's, I'm pretty human. And then on the other hand, Keith, I heard you
Which
mention
is a
that, you
good
know,
thing,
this was
right?
right, yeah,
There's
yeah,
that.
it's not, yeah, I don't want to be a robot. Um, Keith, earlier you were mentioning, and you didn't really finish your thought, but you were talking about how um, AI and the technology of AI and what it's able to produce is sort of shifting the minds of conspiracy theorists, possibly one way or the other on either end of the spectrum. So to me, what I'm hearing is that, especially with this becoming an election year and being such a big year for business owners and everything like that, to me, what I'm hearing is that we don't really know how things are going to play out. We don't really know if it's, are people going to sort of like accept that AI has a lot more power over us than we think. And so now we can be a bit more aware and we can be a bit more proactive. Or is it going to like absolutely like kind of rock our worldview and change the way we see certain conspiracies or not conspiracies? You know, everyone has their own definitions of what is and what isn't. So one thing is on the elections. I'm curious how you guys think that that's going to play out. And but then also as business owners or people working in business, how is that going to sort of like replicate itself a year from now, 2 years from now, et cetera, if that makes sense.
So, in the terms of like playing into election cycles, I think that there was a report recently, and I have to go back and cite it specifically, so I don't have it offhand. But there was some research and publication by OpenAI on like how frequently Russia and China were using ChatGPT and
Oh my
OpenAI
gosh.
systems to
Yeah.
produce content that could be used to trigger individuals, in certain contexts in various countries throughout the world. So it's already happening from
Yep.
countries that have perhaps misaligned interests with the United States or Western, European countries, right? Like that's already happening. And OpenAI has already come forward and said that they've detected those things, right? And so to that point, like I think that is one of the greatest fears that I think a lot of people have is, quite frankly, it does make it very easy to produce what seems like in the language of that native culture, people, country, something that is sort of very, it's no longer like the person sending you a phishing email that doesn't look quite like properly typed and grammatically correct. Like that's actually a solved problem. I was just recently, I can't name or disclose the company, but I was doing some election bias testing, specifically where they had like flags for various nationalities of different contexts. And so I would literally use OpenAI to translate a question into that native language, have it ask the chatbot, like, that thing, and then translate the response back, and then find like the misalignment of the AI. Like it would get the date wrong for the European Parliament election, or it would determine the president of the United States was not the current president. And so it was like clearly their training data set and the AI that they were using was, basically benchmarked on an older set of data. Um, so to that point, like I think the application of this capability or tool set to the problem is very sensitive because even the training data sets for the latest OpenAI models are, I think, what, end of 2023, maybe early 2024 at this point. Like it's not quite current. And so if you ask something from last week, it has to go do retrieval augmented generation, which just to give you an example that's not related to elections, but I think is still sort of funny historically, is I was watching Manhunt on Apple TV, which is about the search for the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. And so I go and I looked up like does James Wilkes, I think it was James Wilkes Booth, but does he hang was the question that I asked because I wasn't super familiar with that moment in history. And I asked on Bing.com of all places, and it responded back with like a little retrieval augmented generation thing. I'm like, yes, he hangs on July the 5th of some year. And it's like, actually, no, that's wrong. And even the article that it pulled from said that that was wrong. Like he actually dies in the process of being captured. He's shot. And so he never goes to trial. And so it's like, even when you are doing things to try and retrieve data from like moments in history that are much more current than training data set, there's still a chance that the machine that is producing statistical likelihood of words fitting together produces a response that is either not accurate, not factual, or just is entirely made up in most cases, because it sort of just pulls everything together in a way that doesn't necessarily prove helpful. And I don't know. I mean, like, I feel the one where I have, and there was a Wired article recently really hammering Perplexity AI for all of its summarization, is a lot of people feel like, hey, it can summarize things really well, except as I've found in a number of cases, like that's just not true. It actually does sort of sprinkle in a little bit of its LLM, as they say, hallucinations, but it's just like, you know, filling the gaps effectively. And then we think about, okay, now if people start using AI-based functionality inside of search engines related to the election, like that could be wrong. It could tell you the position of an individual wrong. It could tell you the voting location or date wrong. It could tell you all sorts of things that are factually incorrect that could impact the way in which people actually, go through the process of exercising their right as a citizen of the country they live in. So there's a whole host of problems there.
I got asked this question or a similar question in 2018, just around like general weaponized misinformation and disinformation affecting North America. And really the question was like, if we're heading towards, it's a dramatic question, but in the sense that like if we're heading towards like a post-truth population, how do you immunize that population against disinformation and things that might be weaponized from an information warfare standpoint? And I was thinking about it through the lens of like, how could the crowd potentially be a part of this and all that kind of stuff? My response, hip shot at the time, was like, just turn the internet up to 11, make it so absurd that you kind of force the population to re-engage critical thinking, and then basically stop, like turn the volume off on that, on a dime, and see if that works. Because at that point in time, you've got to have someone that actually cares that the information they're getting is wrong. Like if that doesn't exist, then everything that we're talking about right now doesn't really matter in the first place. So it's like, how do you re-engage that part? The interesting thing is that COVID kind of hit 2 years later, and that to me kind of pretty much turned things up to 11. And I wouldn't say that necessarily worked in terms of getting people to kind of re-engage critical thinking against that type of misinformation. But I do think that that AI and just the proliferation of it's causing everyone to question what they read and what they see, like wholesale and at a whole of society level, in a way that I don't really feel like I've seen before. And the optimist in me wants to think that creates an opportunity to kind of see some of that sort of desire for the actual facts of a situation or whatever else, like re-engage that kind of critical thought process societally. I think there's potentially an opportunity for that to happen. I think there's tooling available for that, with like responses and output from these sorts of systems, the ability to basically go back over and do kind of almost adversarial AI application to those kind of things, especially when it comes to an issue like election security or like facts that are like fundamental, like democracy. Like you want to screw that up as little as you can. And it's a difficult problem because it's a political information environment. So it's inherently noisy. It's inherently like a little, soft around the edges from a fact standpoint to begin with. So it's just it's a fun problem to deal with in that sense. But pardon me, I do think that there's an opportunity to actually use this stuff to, help people kind of re-engage the fact that like they should actually question what they're reading and what they're seeing and do their own research. And they should actually understand the things that they care about where they want to do that, because you can't necessarily do that for everything. That to me is one area that's pretty intriguing around this. We've seen deep fake stuff go out. I think a lot of folk were really concerned about that early on. To me, that's a fairly pedestrian use of AI in election fraud. Like the whole idea of I think it was Joe Biden calling the residents of New Hampshire. You might have got one of those calls, Keith.
Yep.
Yes. So like that sort of thing's like, yeah, that's the world that we live in now. Like to me, that I saw that, I'm like, okay, that's off the leash now, which is crazy. But also like that's actually kind of a good thing, because when people receive that phone call, they're going to question whether or not it's real, because that was the kind of the follow up from that. So there's this weird balancing act to it that I think we don't really know how it's going to play out and on that side, but I do reserve a little bit of, founderish optimism, that there is, potential to actually take advantage of some of the, like, wait a sec, what is reality, questioning that this sort of stuff creates, to actually reframe the way that people think about facts and the way they digest news and truth and that sort of thing.
I think, one country that's done this really well, though, Casey, to give us like perhaps a model through which the rest of the world can start to follow is Ukraine. Like Ukraine for years, ever since Crimea was invaded by Russia and then taken over, like they have made a part of their culture on just social media and media literacy is like a practice that they teach all young people as they're going through school and university and what have you, because there was an adversary who was very interested in sort of polluting the brain trust of the young people of that country. And so they've done a fantastic job in like really combating and thinking or forcing the thought about that problem. And
Mm.
in some respects, like the thing that, just riffing off of, things that have happened just very recently, like the Stanford Internet Observatory, like funding for research into just these activities that you see on social media of like influence operations and things has already been defunded. And that was very much an act of one political party here in the United States that's actually not, they're interested in the chaos and the misinformation more than they are the like, objective observation of these practices taking place. And so like that unto itself makes things very challenging because there's political parties in the West, various countries all over that have an interest in the disinformation continuing to be seeded into the population because it keeps them in power, as opposed to, parties that think that that's wrong. Like truth is truth, and we should focus on facts as facts. And like this AI tool set and deepfakes and other things make it that much harder to like figure that out.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we're well above our pay grade at this point a little bit on this side of the conversation, because I
Completely.
agree with all of that. It's a difficult like a difficult system level issue to solve. And AI, to me, like what it does is it continues some of the things that we've seen as a result of machine learning and social media networks, as I mentioned before. To me, it's just an extension of that same thing. Like this is basically technology reflecting some of the inherent kind of vulnerabilities that society has, and then potentially actually turning around and exploiting us in that way. I think being mindful of the fact that that's possible is a thing that we've collectively become far more aware of over the past 2 years, because like AI has caused such a shock around that sort of thinking that is actually being responded to through stuff like the executive order out of Joe Biden's office, like the AI, the Bletchley Park Accord in the UK. There's a bunch of stuff happening in the EU. There's stuff happening here in Australia. At a policy level, there's a lot of response trying to form around this, and that will continue to evolve as well. I do think as well there is an opportunity to actually use, like I do think generative AI as a fact checker, or as a tool that can kind of scale in a way that detects this type of thing, like flipping it, kind of going back to what you did with the CDAO program, back at the start of this conversation, Keith, like using AI to basically exploit AI in that same sense. Okay, if you've got AI being used in an adversarial way around information warfare against a particular population group, can you use AI to detect that at scale, and with the kind of speed that you need to be able to stop that stuff, or to cause that kind of pause, that moment where critical thought can creep in. That's a high velocity problem. Like you can't do that with human moderation. You can't necessarily do that with filtering. You need technology to actually kind of meet the speed with which this stuff can be generated. So I actually do see potential applications for AI for that use case. Kind of, I know that there are people actually working on that right now, and I think there's some promise in that area.
Yeah. AI is starting to sound equally humbling and scary. So I'm
to be fair, it's exciting at the same time. Like we've been talking about all of the potential, like the sky is falling. I look
Sure.
at, I mean, you think about AI is just as effective at wasting the time of someone who's trying to scam a member of your family as it is for the scammer to generate that content. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like as defenders, if we can think about it as an issue of basically increasing attacker cost to the point that it becomes economically irrational and they go off and do something else, like I think AI is actually a really useful tool to bring into that to try to scale out those kind of answers to the problems that we've got that are affecting average people. Like this is not necessarily a hacking your business thing that we're talking about right now. We're talking about addressing fraud and scams and romance schemes and all those different things that go on. There's a lot of, I think, really exciting promise for this stuff, not just in like making life easier and giving us new toys to play with and all that kind of stuff, but actually in like taking the fight back to the bad guys. I actually see a lot of exciting uses for AI. So it's not all doom and gloom in that sense. I think it's important to call out that it is a balancing act. I think kind of as you alluded to, Santero, there's this like, it's incredibly powerful. It's a double-edged sword that's like very heavy and very long and very sharp. And like it cuts both ways, but acknowledging both sides of that cut and trying to work on both ends of that problem, I think is a really, really good thing to do.
Yeah. And it sounds like it goes sort of in and out of that balance. That sword is very heavy, so it sounds like we're maintaining equilibrium with it is probably.
We're still learning how to wield it. I think that's kind of the point that we're up to right now.
Yeah, definitely. We're getting better at though, it sounds like. But I want to be conscious of time because I know it's very early for you, Casey, and Keith, it's much later for you. But I wanted to end on one more question for each. Casey, with AI, like we've talked about, being both sort of like a humbling technology, but also a technology that comes with a lot of risk, especially if, like you said, it's a new toy for a lot of people. So people, or by people, I mean corporations or like customers and companies, are sort of just throwing the toy out there and maybe might be a little bit unintentional about the technology that they're putting in front of their customers and the data that they're pulling from it. What is Bugcrowd doing to sort of empower customers to mitigate that risk, or how are we educating them on the risk that comes with AI and what we can provide for them to feel less worried about what AI may potentially cause?
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing is conversations like this, just from an education and from an understanding standpoint. We are offering like consultations as well, so people can kind of reach out and sit down and say, okay, what is your specific problem? Let's not so much talk about this in general terms. Let's talk about this specific set of things that you're trying to deal with as an organization and give input from a strategy standpoint around that. Product-wise, we've got the AI bias offering that was basically built off a lot of what we learned with the CDO program that we're talking about before. And we do have now an AI penetration testing offering as well, which is around kind of some of the Oracle injection type issues that Keith talked about before, as well as the integration points between AI and existing environments, because there are a lot of things that I think get missed. One thing I will say there is that the idea of haste being like the natural enemy of good security and safety decision making. This is an anti-pattern that we've seen now for 12 years. With Bugcrowd, we saw it with IoT. Everyone's like rushing to outpace the competitor to get their IoT product out to market, and then a year or two later, there's a giant trash fire, and Mariah takes down half the internet. And we've spent literally the eight years since then trying to regulate how to do secure by design into IoT. So that's one example. I think another really good one is when Docker first dropped on the internet. You had a whole bunch of developers that didn't necessarily understand network security, provisioning infrastructure on the open internet, and all of a sudden you've got publicly accessible, like no password systems that have a whole lot of administrative access that shouldn't be on the internet. Like there's this consistent theme that when something happens quickly, it's a powerful new technology that everyone wants to use, and there's this competitive drive to get it out to market first. Generally, bad stuff happens. So I think just being mindful of that being a consistent theme. The example that we're seeing a lot of in AI right now is that you've got data scientists that are making data and network security decisions, putting their entire data lake out on the open internet because they're using open source tools to train their models without thinking through AppSec or infrastructure security. It's not because they're dumb, it's because they're data scientists. They're not thinking about security as their priority, right? So like what we've got to do collectively as an industry is to partner with those folk to allow them to move at the speed of business, but also do it in a way that's safe. yeah, really in terms of where Bugcrowd fits in is, yeah, with our model, with our community, with our approach to these types of problems, we're trying to scale the ability for organizations to solve that problem as best we can.
Awesome. I lied. One more question for you, but this is actually going to lead into my question to Keith.
Sure.
Does Bugcrowd have any AI bias testing opportunities coming up for hackers?
We do. There's a bunch. There's none that we can talk about because obviously these are things that we line them up and we invite people in and it goes forward on that basis. But yeah, we do. I think the part that's public that we can call out is that we are involved in the generative red teaming village at DEF CON this year. So we'll be pretty heavily involved in that side of things, and that's something that anyone who's going to be at DEF CON can participate in. I believe it's open for participation for folks that aren't in Las Vegas as well. So just keep an eye out. Yeah, keep an eye out from us on details around that. Keep an eye on the AI village as well. Yeah, that's for everyone. I think for folks that are just looking to cut their teeth into this and start to get involved and see what it's all about, it's a really good opportunity there. And I think for people that are more experienced, there's going to be a lot of good collaboration and kind of community stuff going on as well. So I'd highly recommend that one. But yeah, like sign up for the platform, let us know that you're interested in this stuff, and yeah, it's definitely growing as a space.
Yeah. And then Keith, how can sort of aspiring hackers, or not even just new hackers, existing hackers, how can they start their journey into AI bias testing? What tools would you recommend that they get familiar with? What literature should they kind of be consuming to really kind of like learn about this?
There's a lot of literature. So I would say for a tools perspective, definitely getting, comfortable with and familiar with various chat interfaces, OpenAI, bing.com/chat, like, some of the Google Gemini stuff, like getting used to using and thinking about using AI tools is like step 0, right? Like as soon as you feel comfortable, then it's a matter of, okay, now that I feel somewhat comfortable using this, how can I get creative about the ways in which I try to produce the outcomes I'm trying to achieve? Like that just takes sort of time and testing and rehashing things and throwing different spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, right? Like how long do you want to boil it for? Then in terms of like going and reading, there's a ton of stuff from Microsoft on red teaming, which is like the sort of concept of doing safety and bias testing. There's a lot of stuff out there from Anthropic, OpenAI. Like you can go read all of that. That is going to be helpful to understand like the methodologies behind performing this kind of testing, the thinking that goes into it. But then in terms of like exposing yourself to a world of information that will allow you to identify what is and isn't bias, that sort of just takes a cultural and a societal awareness. So like the more you can just go and read a lot of different information available to you, whether it's news articles, whether it's just like events that have happened, whether it's historical things, like all of that will be useful, and you never know what sort of context it will become useful to you in. But I remember reading a book that truly I recommend nobody goes and reads, only because it is dense. It is like a brick of a book that if you go and read it, you're going to get maybe 10% out of it, but that 10% is going to be good, there's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And, I read it so I'm going to get you the author. It's, let's see here, Daniel Kahneman. And Tversky was his co-author, except that Tversky had died. And so he's sort of like posthumously listed as an author. Anyway, Thinking Fast and Slow is really about the systems of the way that your human brain thinks and heuristics, and a lot of the testing that Kahneman did in his laboratories around testing for bias in people. And I'll tell you, like, I read it twice. I have a psychology degree, and I still maybe got at best 35 to 40% of it. Like, I need to go and like reread it. It's dense. That said, if you want like a good primer on this problem space in one read that is going to take you a lot of time to really understand, that's the book that I'd recommend. But gosh, I mean, just being well read and understanding global cultures and societies and history of various peoples and the just growth of their culture and their society, their country, will help you understand when you see something that appears biased. You'll say, that's bias in the context of the way that this country will see bias, whereas another country might not, right? And so being mindful to that. I mean, I always come back to things like when you think of languages, just by their nature, like in Spanish, there is a masculine and a feminine sort of way in which you will ask or say things, and that's just built into the language that they have.
Mhm.
Whereas if you were to look at like English, that's not necessarily the case. And so even things as subtle as that can play into the way that you're thinking of bias in context for what you're testing in the context in which it's being used. So just
Yeah.
having that knowledge allows you to then go and get creative with these various, generative AI tools to help you produce prompts that will maybe, find something in the model that produces that bias back to you.
Yeah, I got to imagine the more sort of like cultural stuff that you're consuming, the quicker you will be at spotting those gaps that kind of pop up, those little red flags.
I think just adding to that really quickly as well, understanding just at least a 101 level, like what an LLM actually is, like
Yeah.
how it does what it does, how it's trained. Because depending on where you come in from a testing standpoint, that's going to be easy or might be difficult. But at a fundamental level, just the kind of the kind of calculations that are being done, how it actually forms that response, the different ingredients, like what is a context window, what is a token, how is that formed, where does that come from, how are those things derived. I think that's really useful in terms of understanding the relationship between what Keith just talked about in terms of the training data, and then how it actually manifests when you're working with the system. Like to me, that was like putting those things together. Once I got that part, there was a whole bunch of it that just went, oh, okay, I get it now. Like,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah. Wolfram
Awesome.
Alpha has a far too mathematical post on exactly all of that. I linked to it in my blog post about this topic, but it's good because there's also some stuff out there from OpenAI researchers and others who have talked about basically the statistical models behind it. I jokingly say it's all just lies, damned lies, and statistics at the end of the day.